In our society today, oil and gas plays a key role in our everyday life. Texas has had a fairly stable economy because of this industry and its overall influence in how the state operates. It is strange to think about Texas as being a leading oil producer for the world, but we as Texans understand that the Lone Star State is just that great. Like all discoveries, oil and gas took some time to become relevant and fully acquirable. In July of 1543, Louis de Moscoso, survivor of the De Soto expedition, recorded the first sighting of oil in Texas. After the expedition was forced ashore, the explorers noticed this substance floating on the surface of the water. The explorers collected the asphaltic substance and used it to seal their vessels' hulls. Later they discovered that this was actually oil. The discovery and production of oil took off after the mid to 19th century during the Civil War. The demand for kerosene and petroleum products is what created the importance of oil. The first economically significant discovery arose in 1894 in Corsicana in Navarro County in Texas. This oil field peaked in 1900 when it produced 839,000 barrels of oil in that one year. This was important because it laid the foundation for this industry's commercial potential. After this discovery, various explorations began that led to the discovery of the Powell oil field. In 1906, it produced a total of 673,000 barrels of oil and hit its peak in 1924 with a whopping output of 33 million barrels of oil in that year. Roger Olean from the Texas State Historical Association, last modified in 2016, stated this. The discovery that changed the industry as a whole was Spindletop. In Jefferson County, a self-taught geologist and mechanic, Petio Higgins, discovered salt domes. He believed that under these salt domes were oil pockets that were lurking in the depths. Anthony Lucas also shared Higgins' view on the salt domes and found Pennsylvania oilmen John Gailey and Hames Guffey to help fund this exploration. Drilling began in October of 1900, and by January 1901, they had drilled to a depth of over 1,000 feet. On January 10th of 1901, mud began bubbling from the hole, and the workers quickly scattered. On this day, previously, they believed that what they were looking for was worthless. It was a bust. But within minutes, a jet stream of mud shot out of the Lucas well, and it was quickly followed by natural gas and oil. It was reported that this stream that shot from the hole they were drilling from reached a height of over 100 feet. From this day forward, the Lucas Geyser produced around 100,000 barrels of oil every day. In this time, it was a huge turning point for the industry, as Texas had only produced 893,000 barrels of oil in 1900. From this point on, the industry began to skyrocket towards increased output numbers and success. This information was stated in History.com, last modified in 2010 by History staff. Through the early 20th century, refineries and pipelines began to pop up in various locations throughout the major drilling regions. As the oil and gas industry grew rapidly, so did the other industries in its wake, such as railroads. This rapid expansion of both industries in Texas created more job opportunities, and it encouraged rapid movements to these booming regions. Cities such as Wichita Falls experienced an increase from 8,200 to 40,000 people from 1910 to 1920. Oil and gas began to move farther north and west as time continued, and it became quite noticeable that they were finding more and more oil the farther they explored in those directions. During the 30s, the advancement of technology helped the increase in output for the industry. Oil production through the Great Depression seemed to somewhat carry Texas along. As the industry moved forward, so did the amount in which was produced daily. Even with the Railroad Commission regulating the industry, it did not affect how quickly the output of oil and gas was climbing. During the Second World War in its final year, the United States started a project called the Big Inch and Little Big Inch. This was the establishment of pipelines from Texas to the eastern seaboard. It took about a year and a half to fully complete, which was quite an achievement during this time. This feat was achieved because Texas oil production had been controlled by the federal government during the war, and many were in need of work as the government instituted shutdown days. These shutdown days were implemented to decrease the total production so there wasn't any further economic pressures. The industry was subject to change, especially after the United States completed two world wars back to back. After these events, production skyrocketed and the oil and gas industry in Texas helped contribute to the United States' economic recovery.
World War II is a huge boon for the oil industry because not only does it kind of elevate Texas's importance as far as its oil production, but also it meant the birth of the petrochemical industry in Texas. Since the United States was cut off from a lot of natural resources around the world during the war, then there's this need for the development of synthetic materials, a lot of which are derived from oil. And so, what that means is then the more need for the oil produced in Texas, and also leads to the development of the petrochemical industry in Texas, which really ends up being centered around Houston.
As prices increased after the war, the industry continued to grow, and in 1952, the oil output peaked at 15.3 billion barrels in that year. This had been accomplished because numerous oil men during the war had been sitting around and discovered new sites to drill from. A trend that followed after the 50s until the 70s was decreased oil production, but an increase in natural gas exploration and retrieval. It was during the mid 20th century that companies realized the importance for natural gas in the industry and the economy. This led to the increase in the total production of this resource, and that is very relevant today. It was in the 1970s where the Middle East began to increase their individual production of oil, and they raised their price significantly compared to the price the US was holding. In response, the United States increased the overall price per barrel and also increased the overall production as well. This was an important time for Texas to increase production because the National Reserve amount was declining rapidly. The total oil rig count in Texas increased by 35% between 1973 and 1974, and another 26% in 1975. During the 70s, the federal government enacted numerous regulations to control the industry. For the next few decades, international and national issues became issues for Texas. The Middle East was trying to become the leading oil producer by controlling international prices through production and politics. Shortages occurred after the Shah of Iran fell at the end of 78, and that added international pressure. Tax revenue, royalties, leases, etc. accounted for 17.16 of state revenue. Moving into the 80s and 90s, the oil and gas industry began to slow down drastically compared to its past. Reasoning for this was centered around fuel substitutions and decreasing demand because of a push in environmental conservation. These two factors caused prices to drop, and throughout the next 20 years, production was cut by almost 50% compared to the industry peak a few decades before. As the industry was slowing, banks in Texas began to have major issues, workers began to leave, and the Texas economy took a fairly intense hit in this time. The petrochemical industry, on the other hand, fluctuated only slightly, but remained fairly balanced through this cut in production. Regulations ultimately hindered exploration and discovery techniques, and so on, which is what caused the unsuccessful end of the 20th century for the industry. For any industry, a regulatory body is very important in controlling how the industry operates. On April 3, 1891, the Railroad Commission of Texas was established by the legislature, giving the commission jurisdiction over rates and operations for numerous industries, including the oil and gas industry in Texas. One of the first forms of regulation was inspired by legislation that was passed in Pennsylvania in 1899. This statute regulated the protection of groundwater, abandonment of wells, and the conservation of natural gas. It also specified that a well must be shut in within 10 days after its completion until such a time.
In 1917, the state legislature authorized the Texas Railroad Commission, the TRC, to begin regulating the oil industry. And early on, the TRC primarily regulated production levels or pipeline usage. For example, in 1917, um, the TRC said that pipelines had to be what are called common carriers, meaning that they couldn't refuse to transport anybody's oil.
This is the first act to designate the Railroad Commission to administer the conservation laws relating to oil and gas. As the industry changed, numerous laws were passed to keep the industry stable and safe for the environment and persons involved. Many forms of legislation were passed in the first half of the 19th century to ensure conservation, the proper disposal methods, proper utilization of all the necessary resources, and proper procedures after and during drilling. It was in the 1930s where Governor Ross Sterling ordered a field shutdown and sent in the Texas National Guard to enforce his plan. It wasn't until the spring of 1933 that he was able to get significant compliance in the region. The reason Ross sent in the National Guard was because he had the illegal trade of the oil that was produced in East Texas. A remedy for the illegal shipment of these resources was made through the National Industry Recovery Act, which authorized federal interdiction of interstate shipment of oil. During World War II, the federal government created shutdown days for the oil and gas industry in Texas, which cut the industry down by 60% of its potential production levels. After the war, though, the industry was producing at an all-time high. It was in the late 50s and early 60s where cheap foreign oil continued to flow into the U.S., and it caused domestic demand to decrease. To counter the drop in demand, the Railroad Commission limited production to only 8 days a month for almost 2 years, which ended in 1962. It was on April 5th of 1961 where the Railroad Commission was given the right to supervise the shooting, drilling, and completion of wells, and to enact rules for the prevention of waste, and to require wells to be drilled and operated in such a way that it would comply with the policy to prevent injuries. In the United States, the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act was the federal government's response to the shortages that were taking place. It adjusted the price ceiling of old oil upward to a national average of $5.05. New, released, and stripper oil was still uncontrolled and rose to $10.82 in December. In Texas, the response was a dramatic increase in drilling and exploration. The rig count increased 35% between 73 and 74, and 26% the following year. The increased activity slowed the rate of decline of the state's oil production and crude oil reserves. Federal policies changed again in 1976 with the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which reorganized categories of oil, reduced the price of upper-tier oil, and placed ceilings on other categories. Wildcat drilling declined temporarily, but after 6 months, new prices were issued, producing an increase in activity during 1977. On May 19th of 1980, following the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, the Environmental Protection Agency is required to develop regulations and programs for controlling all significant quantities of hazardous waste. It was during the 80s where the cost of lease bonuses, royalties, supplies, and services in compliance with federal regulation, especially the Clean Air Act, drove the cost of exploration even higher. Federal inducements through the Natural Gas Policy Act led oilmen to seek economically risky objectives, notably deep, tight sand gas. The Windfall Profits Tax of 1980 and the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 made it progressively more difficult to raise capital for exploration. Subsequent lowering of the maximum tax rate and the setting of minimum tax standards dried up sources of the risk capital that had funded exploration during the post-war period. From this point forward, the industry experienced great technological advancements which improved overall production efficiency and productivity levels, but it created more loopholes in places where the Railroad Commission did not have regulation. So it added more pressure to the Railroad Commission to implement more rules to control what occurred after the technological advancements. The information stated in this section is located on the Texas Railroad Commission's website, last modified 2016. Throughout the early 2000s, oil prices began to climb and reached an all-time high of $151 in 2008. This was before the financial crisis took place, and the price dropped to $46 as a result. As the markets tried to stabilize, prices fluctuated as the economy experienced growth and regression after the crisis that took place. Today, the oil and gas industry is just now recovering since its bust at the end of the year of 2014. This is stated by Bill Saporito in Texas Takes a Hit, last modified 2016. The price of crude oil dropped from around $110 a barrel to less than $40 a barrel at the end of 2015, according to Dale Kramer at My San Antonio, last modified 2016. Unemployment in Texas rose from 4.2% to 4.4% when the national average was decreasing steadily. These figures equate to the loss of 60,000 energy jobs and 250,000 jobs overall in Texas. This is stated by Robert Garrett at Dallas News, last modified 2016. Throughout Texas, the economy has taken quite a substantial hit from this oil price decrease, but it was not drastic enough to put this state in jeopardy. This issue rose concern not only for the Texas government, but also the United States government and other nations worldwide. The oil and gas industry took a big hit because OPEC, and specifically Saudi Arabia, continued to push the market by producing the same amount of oil when there was an overall decrease. Saudi Arabia claimed that they had enough resources to keep producing at this rate for many years. As a consequence for their steady production, they flooded the market, which caused an oversupply when demand for oil was decreasing. This industry was impacted by more than just an oversupply. Prices decreased because of the strong US dollar, the Iranian nuclear deal, and the lack of stabilization of the market by OPEC. Evan Tarver states this in Investopedia, last modified in 2015. In the year 2015, Texas produced a total of 4.35 billion, down 25.5% year over year. Natural gas was also down 3.2% in June of 2015. This declination was caused by the loss of 600 rigs in the state. This is stated in the Oil and Gas Journal, last modified in 2016. In 2014, controversy arose when North Texas experienced numerous earthquakes, which occurred specifically in the same regions as the Barnett Shale. After much investigation, it was reported that these earthquakes were in correlation to saltwater disposal wells located in these areas. Saltwater is significant in North Texas because a lot of what is obtained from the earth, along with oil and gas, is saltwater. This saltwater is highly toxic and needs to be disposed of properly, but for the longest time, companies were shooting this substance back into the earth. After numerous earthquakes, companies halted saltwater disposals in North Texas, and the earthquakes ceased. No one actually has definitive information that states that these disposals are the truth of the causation of these quakes, but many believe that this was the actual issue. Since North Texas lies on a fault line, North Texas geologists believe that the saltwater disrupted the faults, and that's what ultimately caused the earthquakes to take place. As the oil and gas industry has progressed into the 21st century, it has experienced multiple technological changes. Numerous entrepreneurs and corporations today are looking for alternate ways to provide energy to the world. We have seen just in the past 5 years a slight decrease in the demand for oil. Alternative energy sources are being researched to provide a cleaner and more efficient energy source for the world. If such energy sources arise and overtake the oil and gas industry, how will that affect Texas? The Lone Star State has been built on the foundation laid by the oil and gas industry, a foundation that has helped mold Texas into the strong state that it is. Many oil companies will likely turn over to utilizing those sources, but the question remains, how will Texas be impacted by such change? Texas has always held a significant hand in the energy industry. It is certain that such changes will only cause the state to expand its horizons in the energy business. For Texas being a leading energy supplier for the past 120 years, it can be assumed that Texas is already working towards cleaner, more efficient fuel sources.